Oof. What a long day. It's been a long day, awful day. I'm sick, I'm tired, and I'm gonna have myself a beer. So, let me enjoy. Wait a minute. What are you doing here? There wasn't supposed to be any videos, but yeah, I guess it's still October and we still need to have a Halloweeny video. So, well, I guess for today's video we're gonna take it a little bit easy. We're gonna be a little laid back. As you can tell, maybe here you can see my little aqua shirt, but we're taking it very easy on the channel right now. So, since we don't really have a super spooky video to watch, we're going to talk about a very neat, cool thriller known as The Somnium Files.
The Somnium Files, which will henceforth simply be known as is a visual novel from Kotaro Uchikoshi, which created the critically acclaimed Zero Escape games, which, if incredibly simplified for someone who's never played them, is a series of escape games reminiscent of the Saw films, where 9 characters are trapped in a slowly sinking cruise ship and have 9 hours to find a special marked door with the number 9 on it, and their attempts to escape it pits them all in a life or death struggle to solve this puzzle. The game was an unexpected success, which spawned 2 more games in the series, all directed by Uchikoshi, those being Virtue's Last Reward and Zero Time Dilemma, that continued the story of the nonary game and the villain Zero. Lately, Uchikoshi has gone in an endeavor with Kazutaka Kodaka, which is the mastermind of his own escape game visual novel series Danganronpa, and created a new development studio in Tomthechosen Games. That sounds like a match made in heaven, but it may take some time before anything groundbreaking comes out because since the 2007 founding of the studio, 4 projects have come out so far, those being Death Come True, an FMV murder mystery game, World's End Club, from which a quick glance looks like a Danganronpa babies, and an anime property known as Akudama Drive.
Now I'm pretty sure that they're cooking some cool stuff over at Tomthechosen Games. But for today's video, we're going to be taking a look at Uchikoshi's last title that he directed for Spike Chunsoft.
In you play the role of one Kaname Date, a special agent for an investigative agency in Japan known as ABIS, or Advanced Brain Investigation Squad, the details of which I'll get a bit into later. With you throughout most of the game is your trusty AI partner and literal left eye, Aiba, which is a robot that takes the shape of a synthetic eye that will help you with X-ray vision, thermal scanning, and most of the game's cracking of awful jokes. Game starts off in a rain-drenched abandoned theme park where a murder has been reported. A woman lies to a carousel, stabbed multiple times, and her left eye has been removed. While investigating the scene, you come across a girl inside of a closet in the carousel. Her being, of course, your roommate and daughter of the deceased, Mizuki, and to cap it off, she's holding the murder weapon. While trying to question Mizuki, we end up figuring out that she has aphonia, which is the inability to speak due, in this case, witnessing a traumatic event, the details of which the player will need to extract throughout the investigation. From there on, we learn more peculiarities with the investigation, as it has a lot of similarities with a set of murders that occurred several years earlier, perpetrated by a man known as the Cyclops Killer, of which Dante cannot remember because of his amnesiac condition.
The beginning, fellas, the prologue is pretty great. It has all the right kind of elements to get you in. A neat mystery that needs to be solved, a past that we don't quite know about, and some very cool twists right there, right at the beginning to get you gripped into it. But before we get too ahead of ourselves with the story, let's talk about the gameplay first.
Generally, the game functions like most other visual novels. You have a typically linear set of chapters that you read/watch to experience the story, with different segments depending on what you're doing. You could be talking to different characters, which will give you some rudimentary dialogue options to further the investigation, or you could be looking through the scene to look for clues, which could range from how heavy a set of barrels are to getting the details of when someone roughly died. It's in these segments where Aiba comes in handy by using X-ray vision to see behind certain objects to find clues that people may be hiding, or to get new insight into someone's behavior, but sadly for Dante, X-ray vision can't look through women's clothes. Similarly, thermal vision comes in handy to figure out if someone is flustered or lying via their body heat, or sometimes it can be figuring out that someone was just at the local perfectly legitimate non-druggy Yakuza headquarters by a freshly smoked Winston cigarette.
Now this might sound like your typical visual novel fare, but I'm telling you, there's a certain point in the investigation where you're gonna hit a rut, and the only way to get through it and figure out the full mystery is to get inside of a man's head.
Eventually, the investigation will reach a point where you need to get information from someone, but they ain't talking. Sometimes, quite literally, you need to do what Abyss does best, and that is to sync with the person at hand. Essentially, syncing is taking a subject, Date and Aiba, as an intermediary into the subject's somnium, which, for all of us Romani Patrici out there, means dream in Latin. In this sequence and how it affects the general plot of the game is what makes I really stand out from other visual novels, in the same way that the escape sequences in Zero Escape did. What the sync, as they call it, does is change the perspective of the game over from a relatively static visual novel style perspective to a third-person one where you follow Aiba and the subject's somnia, a reality deep within their psyche that is formulated through dreams. Dreams are interesting concepts because whatever we see or think we see in them aren't wholly original, as the mind and rapid eye movement, aka REM, can only really produce things that the individual has experienced, whether through sight, sound, smell, or the other senses. It's through these experiences that Abyss hopes to find clues to further the investigation. Since the subject had to experience or otherwise witnessed it in some way, it's through agents like Date and Aiba that know what needs to be done to get the right answers. Though there is one limit to the sync, and that is the fact that Date and Aiba only have 6 minutes every sync to get through the desired results. Otherwise, some really whack things happen to the ego if you stay too long.
But depending on how you get to a certain conclusion within the Somnium could lead to drastically different changes over the course of the events of the game.
In the 6 minutes that you're allowed in someone's somnium, you have to break down a series of mental blocks to figure out at the heart of what ails an individual, or in other cases, to figure out what they're hiding. How you break down those blocks is dependent on how the player interprets the dream, so to speak. In one case, without spoiling it, you're tasked with figuring out what a character is hiding, and the character and their perceptions of events can clearly be considered delusional. Now, when venturing into that character's somnium, it's up to you whether to sift through her delusion and find the truth, or alternatively, indulge in her delusion and see where it goes, which can have drastically different outcomes to the story. So in essence, how you interpret the dreams is how the plot of the game goes along, because you follow the threads of the investigation with what you perceive to be the truth, which will lead you to the branching paths in the story and is how the root system works. Interpret a somnium in a certain way and the game will branch off in a particular direction that usually focuses on a specific character that brings out their backstory, ambitions, and motivations, but a bit more on that later. It can also mean that the story goes balls to the wall and drops a shocking moment or two, like several characters that you just got acquainted with and enjoyed their company getting horrifically moited.
So to wrap up this little part on syncing, I think it's a very cool novel idea to put into, well, a visual novel that kind of really drastically changes up how the course of the events of the game go along. Just by depending on how you perceive it, can have drastic changes and it keeps you on edge. But let's keep going with the plot.
The standard that I want out of my visual novels, fellas, is pretty basic. At the heart of it, I just want a story that will keep me engaged and makes me want to go through it chapter after chapter. And I can positively say, fellas, that I will do that for you. I's narrative is gripping and it always keeps you on edge as you never know where the hell the story is going to go. And I won't lie, it friggin' goes places in some of the different routes. Without trying to spoil it, there are certain routes in this game where you might think, oh, you're about to solve the mystery, and then a big whammy comes out of nowhere that changes how the rest of the plot goes forward, and I isn't a game that holds back when it comes to the subject matter. Though I guess for some, it might need to be said, but if you're not comfortable with subject matter like graphic violence, especially targeted towards children, then there's parts of this game that are definitely going to be hard to go through for you.
But for a sicko like me, that's exactly the kind of content that I want to see in my visual novel, especially one of these thrillers. But it ain't always going to be awful, horrendous, ultra-violence. We gotta get some awful jokes out of the way first.
Similar to Uchikoshi's other titles, Ai has an absolutely awful habit of dropping just terrible jokes out of nowhere, and some references that'll either have you smiling or shaking your head in disbelief. Whether it be Dante shouting Aiba's name like it's Otacon shouting for Snake, or even a pretty obscure reference to Shadow of Destiny, it puts a goofy little smile that they would be so bold to even say such a thing in this game. Other elements of the humor come from just how wonderfully shameless Dante is to everyone. Sometimes it's his unhealthy habit of being immediately distracted by porno mags on the floor, and other times it's asking out the receptionist at Lemniscate to go to a Tommy, or how big her boobs are. Ai is also a game that isn't afraid to get too ridiculous with some of its set pieces, and once again, I feel cheap without elaborating too hard, but sometimes you gotta use some lazy underwear to get yourself out of a life or death situation.
Of course, not the entire game is an onslaught of terrible jokes and horrendous violence. Every so often, Ai has to slow down so it can have some more tender moments with some of its characters.
Over the course of the game, you're going to get to know practically every single main character's motivation and backstory going through the arcs, as once again, without spoiling it, every single branch of the overall story that I mentioned before tends to focus on a singular character and their relation to their overall plot and Dante. This approach I really enjoy as it fleshes out every character you come across. A complaint that I have with a lot of other visual novels is that they'll introduce a cast of characters and then kill some off prematurely before you really had an understanding of who they were and what drove them. Refreshingly, because of the branch system, in one branch you get to know somebody very briefly before they get horrendously moited, only for later on in the game in another branch to really flesh out the character to where you feel even worse for them when you have to revisit that prior branch with some new knowledge. And even does the impossible and makes some previously established super annoying characters actually bearable to talk to, instead of wondering how are they going to derail the plot yet again. That being said, still couldn't find a way to make the pervy bar owner any less annoying. But if you thought the content of the game was going to be all jokes, moitas, and tenderness, then you're, of course, wrong once more, since there's always going to be a whole boatload of really sad and disturbing themes in Ai, ranging the gambit from terminal illness to the long slow decay of dementia, and even some child abuse and abandonment.
Now, I could talk endlessly about all the characters in this game, but to do that, you gotta go into some spoiler territories. So instead, let's kind of leave that behind and let's wrap up this super insane, crazy plot of a game that is Ai.
Like your typical visual novel, Ai has a selection of endings that could be comprised of good and bad endings. But while those endings I would describe as kind of being parallel to each other, with Ai we get something a little different and refreshing for that matter. There will be a point in the game where you reach a certain conclusion and it leaves you in a cliffhanger, and one that really does have you screaming for more, but in order to get towards the ending, you need to go through some of the other branches first. Going through the other branches, as I mentioned before, we'll be going through a deep dive into each of the characters and their motivations, which will have you work out bit by bit the context that every character is coming from and a sort of overview of the greater plot. Once you get all the context behind what the game has going for it, then it finally allows you to continue that one branch that had the cliffhanger, which will then set you on a roller coaster ride through the most whack shish. Good news is at this point, the final branch culminates on the true ending of the game, so it takes everything we've learned throughout the game, getting a few more shocks and revelation before it all comes to a final, satisfying conclusion, even ending with a sequence that leaves me in disbelief.
Ultimately, Ai has a really refreshing take on how it presents the events in its games, and I'm really glad that Uchikoshi and the gang developed it that way.
So many other visual novels have this problem where to get to the ending you have to go through the game numerous times and redo certain decisions from a different perspective to get the different endings, but what it ultimately amounts down to is busy work by going through the game over and over again. AI solves this by not just having a slick and easy system to navigate all the other chapters you have come across, but to go to the sinks so you can directly alter the path and unlock a new branch for you to complete without any of the hassle that the more common method has. I also think that allowing the player, even if it's more linear than you might think, to come up with how they interpret the Somnium, and from there changing how the plot goes forward in a significant manner, to be a novel idea that really made me look at events in a game in a different light, refreshing characters that I had disregarded and creating more teary-eyed moments than I could count.
Overall, you are not going to be disappointed with the story of I, because there's a lot of it to go around and it's all wonderful and great to go through. But of course, that's a story. Let's kind of wrap that up and let's start talking about the game's presentation.
Like so many other aspects of I, the presentation itself is a cut above most other visual novels, which you can see pretty much immediately from the opening cutscene. While a lot of other visual novels, including great ones like Danganronpa, use relatively barren backgrounds and a selection of expressive sprites for when the characters are talking, I does away with that and brings in detailed 3D models for all the characters. To go back to the opening cutscene, while it uses all the bells and whistles of the engine to set the mood of a recently found Moida, most of the other visual novels would have a pre-rendered cutscene that matches this quality. Only real gripe I have with the models and animation is that the little animated icon on the corner can be a bit stiff with some of the animations. The models presumably doing the same animations on screen, so to speak, are just fine, but the icon can be kinda stiff at times.
And of course, since we're talking about facial animations, that must mean that I is voice acted, and I'm glad to say that it is voice acted throughout the entire game.
As you may or may not know, a lot of visual novels might not be fully voice acted throughout the whole game. Hell, some critically acclaimed VNs like Danganronpa or even higher budget titles like Persona only have voice acting for a very few specific scenes. Most of the voice actors do a pretty decent job as well. Out of the whole cast, there's maybe a few characters whose voices became grating. Those mostly being a certain bartender that I'm not gonna show, and that friggin' dork Oda, but at least for the latter, it kinda grows on ya. But if you're not down with the clown when it comes to the English voiceover, then there's always an option to play through the whole game with the Japanese cast, which while I haven't played through I in Japanese, I've heard the Japanese cast gets the job done.
Now that we got the actors out of the way, I guess the final part that we should talk about is the soundtrack composed by Keisuke Ito, which, while not the most memorable soundtrack, it does have a few really great tracks.
I won't lie in saying that I doesn't have the most memorable soundtrack. It certainly isn't on the same level as Masafumi Takeda's soundtracks with Danganronpa or Shoji Meguro's tracks with Persona, but Ito gets the job done with some standout tracks. There's two main types of tracks that you're gonna hear in I, and those are the ones that can be found in basically different locations, with some being more calming in a charming, homely abode, or others cranking up the intensity for a big revelation or racing against time. But starting off with the former, there's a few tracks in the game that really bring out that familial warmness, which we can hear now with Absolute Isolation, which plays in one of the main characters' home. It's a nice soothing track that makes you feel that in the middle of this emotional whirlwind that is investigating the murder and finding new and more shocking events, there's always this eye of the storm that can be found with the comfort of certain characters. Another track of a similar caliber that I enjoy is called Armed Insurgents, that plays when you're in the care of a family of recently reforming Yakuza. It's a track that starts off bombastic as you would expect with the heightened tensions of stumbling into a Yakuza den, but soon mellows out into a nice tune to talk about the criminal underworld.
Now that's all well and good, but the tracks that we really want to talk about are the ones that can only be found within, that being inside the Somnium.
All of the tracks that have to do with sinking are usually named after their respective subjects. For example, for someone in the beginning that is going through a lot of emotional distress is known as Sinking into Pain, which is the first one we're going to talk about. For one, it's got that funhouse sort of whimsy to it, alluding to the fact that it's coming from someone juvenile, while the subject matter is a mixture of innocent imagery and morbid reality regarding the death from the beginning of the game. It's easy listening, which is good because you're going to be listening to this track for a solid 6 minutes before the time limit of syncing kicks in, which is something to say compared to our next track. The second track we're going to be talking about here is called Singing in the Vein, which is the exact opposite from the last one, and it immediately hits us with some hard industrial sound that wouldn't be too out of place in the Silent Hill soundtrack. Droning klaxons, muffled wails from afar, and we can definitely tell that the Somnium on the current subject is very, very perturbed. And while I'm not going to show any footage from the sync in order to not spoil anything, the actual visuals of that particular sync wouldn't be out of place in a Silent Hill Otherworld. And lastly, before we conclude this segment, there's one final Somnium track that I would like to talk about, which is called Sinking in the Captain, which compared to the last two feels like a sort of catharsis in the game. As usual, I won't divulge the details of where or when you'll hear this track, but for the content that is happening on screen, let me just say that it feels like a great way to get some conclusion. Whether it be the whole game or just with a character, it really puts the whole game and all the characters into perspective. This track and the sequence it plays is probably one of my favorite moments in the game, just to showcase that while the initial murder is what gets the plot going, at the heart of things in it's about the characters and the experiences, and man, what an experience it is. There's also the game's theme song that I'm not going to get into because if I have to hear Iris sing that damn song one more time, ooh, I'm going to go insane. So let's leave it there and wrap this baby up.
So with all the great content that there is to be had in the Somnium Files, I am very glad to give it a fantastic 9 out of 10.
Fellas, for a visual novel, sets the bar to new heights to which I'm going to compare to a lot of newer VNs to. It has an engaging plot that keeps you guessing and on the edge of your seat, an excellent cast of characters that will warm your heart as much as they'll make you chuckle, and an extensive story to go through that will have you feeling fulfilled at the whole experience. I personally think that it will end up amongst the classics that Uchikoshi has developed and will stand the test of time as a great visual novel for those wanting to get a good old murder mystery out of the way. And as such, it's fitting content for Halloweeny season. While it might not be the scariest thriller out there, it hits all the right beats and gets the job done. And if there's anything I would watch out for is to get the game on sale, as it can be a little bit expensive at full price, which is probably my only big gripe. If you like Danganronpa, the Zero Escape games, or even just a good old murder thriller, then I would advise you to pick it up and be on the lookout for the sequel to coming out sometime next year, I think.
Wow, fellas, made it to the end of the video. That means I can kick back, relax, and take it easy. But for all the fellas that made it this far, thank you so much. I appreciate every single one of your goofy views. And for all the people that made it here that are new, well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content here, and maybe I can entice you to some of the content in the backlog. And maybe, maybe you could even subscribe if you know what I'm saying. But with that, we're going to have a little PSA. Sadly, this is going to be the last year of 2021. After this, I got to go on a huge trip. Actually, I'm going to go to Munich to have some pole lantern for myself. But I digress. After this trip, it's top 10 season, and for all the people that have seen those are nice, big, wonderful feature-length videos, so I'm going to be busy with those. So the next video like this probably won't happen until well into 2022. But with that, I hope everybody has a great Halloweeny, followed by a great Crimbus and a great Happy New Year. But anyways, that's for whenever. Right now, it's October, it's Halloweeny season. I'm going to kick back, relax. This is Tomthechosen1. Gonna take a nice sip out of my pole lantern, and I'll see you guys next time.
He is all that remains of a once powerful nation. Right now, you're on the threshold of an amazing adventure.